Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Jen if you're new here, and I am a neurodivergent, disabled, chronically ill writer and PhD student, and generally I like to vlog and document that process, so you're more than welcome to be here. But today I wanted to talk a little bit about heat intolerance, or experiences with heat, I guess, and being chronically ill, but in the specific context of adrenal insufficiency and POTS syndrome, which I'll explain a little bit more, but I suppose those are my specific backgrounds, but also to explain how heat can be impacting you if you are autistic or, you know, sensory sensitive in a different way. So that's what we're going to break down today. But yeah, let's get going. So I suppose the first thing to say is that I'm actually on a retreat at the moment in Kylemore Abbey in Galway, so this background is almost like a hotel room. That's the reason. The reason I decided to film this today of all days is because last week in Ireland we had a heat wave. It was a pretty intense heat wave. On the hottest day, I think it was 32 degrees, and that was when my best friend and I chose to go wedding dress shopping. I'm her maid of honour. And this necklace actually is a little knot that she gave me when she asked me to help her tie the knot, which was lovely. But we were really excited to go wedding dress shopping, and it was 32 degrees. And I can't even complain because I wasn't the one changing in and out of dresses all day. But it was an experience. So I guess it's cooled down now, so I feel like I can actually think. That was part of it, I guess, was the brain fog. But I wanted to talk about it because that heatwave experience brought along a lot of, I suppose, reflections for me over the last year of how I have changed in terms of my response to heat, what has worked for me, what hasn't, what's evolved, what's changed, all of those kind of things. So that's kind of the context for this video, I guess. So I suppose to give you two different contexts and background, even though I just explained what I'm doing today and said that was the context, but I suppose I wanted to explain a little bit about my medical background and also an Irish context of heat. I suppose to give a brief overview of Ireland, if you haven't been here before, the weather is generally very dreary. In summer we can get heat, but it is heat in the context of it can still be, I suppose, quite humid, and it can still rain quite a bit, and it's probably max, maybe like, well, not max, but I suppose average. Our warmest summer is probably like 25, 26 degrees Celsius, maybe. It depends where you are in the country. But it's not something we're typically used to. It's also something that I think the rest of the world, certainly my friends that live around the world, whenever I tell them we're in a heat wave and we're panicked and we can't cope, they kind of almost laugh, because they might live in, European countries where it's 40 degrees Celsius, or they're in Australia or whatever. But in reality, Ireland is not built for it in terms of infrastructure. We have no aircon in any buildings, and all of our buildings are made of concrete. So they are made to keep in the heat. So generally everyone struggles mostly with sleeping because our buildings are so warm. Which is, I think, fair enough. So that's just an Irish context of heat. So when a heat wave came about, and it was, the latter end of the 20s and into maybe early 30s, I think probably at the warmest, as a country we were unable to cope. Again, it's similar to what happens whenever we have snow. We shut down as a country because we have no infrastructure for dealing with snow and ice either. Basically, we don't have an infrastructure or a way of coping with extremes on any end of the scale. Heat is kind of no different, but it does mean, as someone who experiences challenges related to heat, it's not something that I suppose you have time to build up a tolerance to, if you even can build up a tolerance to it when you're chronically ill, but it's not something you get the opportunity to build up a tolerance to in Ireland, to be honest. So yeah. And I suppose to explain my medical background if you're new here, I am 30 years old, I am autistic, and I have AuDHD, and I was diagnosed when I was 26. Prior to that, in 2015, I was diagnosed with POTS syndrome, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia. Long story short, in terms of my medical history, I've been unwell for a while, I guess. I was unwell for probably 11 years. Very slowly and steadily, and one of these set of symptoms, I guess, was really related to blood pressure, but also heat intolerance. And that led to a diagnosis of POTS syndrome, which essentially, as far as my understanding of POTS syndrome, means that it explained the dizziness and things that I was feeling, which a lot of people can faint. I don't tend to faint really, and I didn't when my POTS was very active either. I would just feel extremely faint frequently, but that tends to mean that when I change postures from lying to sitting, standing to sitting, even, you know, sitting to standing, anything like that, minor postures to be honest, legs up, legs down, things like that. It's part of why I prefer to film on the floor a lot of the time, is because I can curl my legs up in different ways and I can move them around and stuff like that, in ways that I find hard if I've been at a desk. So yeah, it basically means that the blood pressure, I suppose, drops, and what tends to happen, or I suppose what should happen if you were someone without POTS, is that your blood vessels in your legs constrict when you change posture, like when you stand up, so it shoves the blood back up to your heart and your head, and that ultimately stabilizes your blood pressure and keeps you able to get up and get out. In POTS, that tends to not happen at all, and that leads to blood pooling in your legs, really. And a lot of people will experience a lot of itchiness in their legs, I think due to this, maybe a side effect of medication, but it is really uncomfortable. But the vast majority of people with POTS will just be extremely dizzy as well. I don't say just to connotate that that's the only symptom. That is probably the primary symptom of things. So I was diagnosed with POTS in 2015, and I knew that diagnosis probably didn't cover everything that was going on, but it was the closest I was getting at the time. I did a tilt table test, which I don't recommend to anyone. That sounds almost like I'm fear-mongering, and I understand, but it was a very hard experience. However, throughout the next years after 2015, I continued to get sick, I guess. I had periods where I was not doing too badly. I had periods where I was okay, I was kind of holding it together. And then times when I was actively getting quite weaker in a way that was not related to POTS, or the symptom set wasn't related to POTS. And in 2023, I was diagnosed with adrenal insufficiency, or secondary Addison's disease, which essentially means that, I suppose, in primary Addison's disease, if you don't know, your adrenal glands, which are like triangles, like little hats that sit on top of your kidneys, that secrete cortisol, they stop working, and they can stop working quite suddenly if it's an autoimmune kind of origin. However, in secondary, it means that your pituitary, which tells your adrenals to secrete the cortisol, stops communicating to your adrenals. So technically, I guess my adrenals should be healthy. I'm not sure if that's true, I don't know, but for me it's a pituitary problem, I guess. This diagnosis was a really big deal for me and a big turning point for me, because this had been what was the underlying cause of a lot of different things, and ultimately they believe what contributed to my POTS, and potentially maybe caused my POTS. So at the moment I think I am down in my medical notes as having secondary POTS, like secondary to Addison's disease, but I'm not quite sure. It's something that is managed through taking synthetic cortisol, which is usually hydrocortisone as a steroid, usually in Ireland anyway. There's other steroid types and things like that. It means being on steroids for life, to be honest, and that in itself can cause a lot of problems. It's just a little bit tricky. So I suppose what I'm dealing with, I guess, is a mixture of POTS, neurodivergence, and Addison's disease. There's other things going on there as well, like in terms of just life and everything like that, but these are the kind of three cohorts that intermingle around my experiences with tolerating and not tolerating heat. So they're kind of vital. So just to add an additional note around adrenal insufficiency, I'm not a medical expert, so take everything I say with a pinch of salt, but my understanding is that cortisol helps to regulate body temperature. I found this really interesting when I was diagnosed, and kind of a relief, because prior to diagnosis my body temperature was extremely erratic, bordering on cold to be honest all the time, but I would also frequently get sweats in contexts that didn't make sense to get sweats. I also found it hard to shake off a temperature. So what I mean is, if I was in a room that was boiling warm, if I was someone who was healthy, I might be able to go outside and get fresh air and cool down, but I wouldn't cool down. It would last for hours. Similarly, if I was in a place that was really cold, I could not shake that cold for hours. And the longer I was sick, the longer that stretch of time was. As a result, it meant that any time I overheated, I would lose a lot of fluids through sweat. Prior to diagnosis, I remember thinking this was kind of strange because I knew the sweat that I lost during this time was not the same as sweat, for example, when you're exercising. I knew this sweat almost felt like water. It didn't smell at all, thank God. Praise the Lord, small mercies. But it was so different. It felt like I was extremely porous. I could not keep fluid in. So you can imagine my relief when I was diagnosed and put on synthetic cortisol. My temperature really, really improved in terms of my tolerance for cold. However, steroids have a lovely side effect of causing water retention. This is, partially what causes, or I suppose largely what can cause a lot of weight gain in individuals on steroids for life. It's something I've seen, it's something I'm highly conscious of. But also not just weight gain, but a fluctuating weight depending on how much water you're retaining. The problem is the amount of water you're retaining does depend once again on temperature. So what I found is whilst I could suddenly tolerate cold much better and shake off cold and it wouldn't knock me double. I meant to say like I would be doubled over. Anyway, it kind of wouldn't knock the wind out of me, I guess, but I would find that with heat, I would sweat and feel so burningly warm internally, almost in a dry sense all of the time. And it wouldn't necessarily take a hot environment for that to happen. It would be the slightest of movements. This can happen, I suppose, when you are settling into your medication. However, I remember when I was told that I was going to need to spend maybe the next 2 to 3 years settling into my medication, I didn't care about that. I personally disregarded that completely when I was diagnosed because I was so happy to be diagnosed. I was like, I will master this. I will figure out the ways and tricks of Addison's disease and I will take all the meds and I will do it. That worked-ish, except I still had to let the body heal the way it had to heal because my body was in fight or flight mode for those 11 years. Potentially just struggling to manage temperature-wise for God knows how many of those years. So I still needed long enough on steroids for my body to learn that this crucial hormone was not going to disappear. It wasn't going to go anywhere. My body could calm down and know that if I was in an environment where that was very warm or very cold, it didn't have to be panic stations. It could just calm down. I'm now, I suppose I was diagnosed in January 2023, so it's now July 2025, so I suppose 2.5 years. And sadly, it's like when someone tells you that exercising helps your mental health and it's disappointing when it's true. Sadly, the doctors were right. Time is what has mattered more than any of the effort I have put into managing my condition. Anything. Like all of the logs I've made, the apps I use, the notes I take, the regimes I come up with, all of these things, none of that has mattered or made as much of a difference as time. So I want to just kind of go through, I suppose, some different heat and summer specifically related conditions, but like in relation to neurodiversity and POTS as well. But also, I think this might be nice for me to log because last summer was very, very difficult in heat due to the heat. And it is difficult this summer, but not the same level of difficulty. And I'm really interested to see where I'll be next year. And it is my hope that eventually I'll just be able to tolerate heat like a healthy person. But we will see. So I suppose because I've already talked about the health side of things a little bit, we might as well stick there and we'll talk about autism and neurodiversity at the end maybe, even though they're very much not a background consideration to my day-to-day life. However, it's probably smarter to kind of stay on the same thread of conversation. With my journey with managing heat, I guess, differently, last summer was particularly challenging. Last summer was not even particularly warm. I think it was like an average summer in Ireland. Maybe we had a very warm week or two, but it was generally pretty average. That didn't matter. Last March 24, I had an adrenal crisis, which is an event that can happen when you have Addison's disease. Sometimes it's called an Addisonian crisis, I think, but to me, an Addisonian crisis is for someone with primary Addison's disease, because true Addison's disease and the title Addison's disease is related to primary, which is when the fault is with your adrenals, whereas secondary is adrenal insufficiency. So for me, it's an adrenal crisis. I'd say secondary Addison's disease because a lot of doctors have referred to it that way for me, and that's what I've kind of picked up, but it's not actually super accurate. Adrenal insufficiency is where we're at. But either way, I had a crisis, which essentially means that you experience some reason in which you cannot keep down your synthetic steroids or you're not absorbing them. This might be due to a vomiting bug, diarrhea, an event like, say, it could be something like a car crash where your body has sustained a severe shock, which would ultimately means it needs extra cortisol, but it has nothing, and you're not in a position to take any of your tablets and let them absorb. Generally, what you need in these scenarios is an emergency injection. For me, I think I had a virus that day, I'm not even really sure, but I had a crisis. It was well managed. It was awkward in terms of getting an ambulance and all of that kind of thing, but I was fine. These are really, these can be quite fatal events. So they are very serious, so I'm very glad it was fine. However, for that, I remember hearing from the doctor. I was very lucky when I was in A&E that the consulting doctor, I think at like 2 a.m, was an endocrinologist. And I remember he said to me like that it can take a really long time to recover from an adrenal crisis in a lot of ways. And I wanted to leave. I didn't care. I was like, I know, I will do the research. I will figure it out. Once again, I will manage this. I will do all of the right things. I'm a very pedantic person. I'm very much like I see a thing through if I'm told to do it. I just wanted to leave. I think in the months after I realised what he meant. As usual, it takes me a while. But what I found is obviously I had the immediate exhaustion after that crisis and the immediate stressor on the body, and also the immediate aftermath of having such an influx of steroid. You go from taking maybe between 15 and 20 milligrams a day to, an IV drip or an injection of 100. I think I had 100 and 250s. So like it's quite a lot on the body to take. However, that's kind of short-term changes in management that's required. There's also the long-term. And the long term for me, I realised, was that any kind of headway I had made in my stability, which to be fair, I'd made it like, 13 months post-diagnosis without having a crisis. Any kind of slow and steady stability I had made kind of went out the window in terms of like, sorry, I just kicked the camera. In terms of odd things, like one of them being temperature control. I found my temperature control was extremely poor. I also think it's probably worth noting how my crisis was impacted that day by the fact that I began the day on really crowded public transport with no windows open, and I started to sweat. And I mean, I think when someone with Addison's disease or any maybe hormonal imbalance says they're sweating, this isn't sweating. Like, you are drowning in your own sweat, but you can feel it leaving your body to the point at which you feel like a husk inside, you feel dried out. The only accurate description I've ever heard about it is, to be honest, when I've heard menopausal women talk about their experience, which I suppose makes sense because that's about hormonal changes too. I remember being quite panicked because whether my, other pituitary pathways were stable and maybe I was having hormonal changes to do with like my fertility pathways and like my reproductive hormones, and that actually I was going through a kind of perimenopause, but they were actually fine, and it was an adjustment to steroid thing, but that's fine. What I found was my ability to tolerate any kind of length of walking went out the window. It had been weak enough beforehand, but it had been slowly improving, but it became quite weak, especially if it was vaguely warm out. And by vaguely warm, I mean maybe over 18 degrees. and if the humidity was strong. It's funny how quickly you feel like you step outside and you can feel I imagine it must be like what a tree would feel like if all the sap was pulled out of it. You feel it leaching out of your legs and your leg muscles suddenly become exceptionally weak. To manage this, I was put on a second steroid to help me retain water, or retain salt as well, more, and help me kind of balance out those kind of minerals, I guess. I was put on this not on the basis of adrenal insufficiency, but on the basis of POTS syndrome. It's called fludrocortisone, and fludrocortisone is typically only used in Addison's disease, which is that primary type where your adrenals are the ones struggling. Whereas it's also used in treatment of POTS, and I felt like what this crisis did was it brought back my POTS symptoms, the dizziness, all of those kind of things, my craving for salt, with a vengeance. POTS, since being diagnosed in 2015, probably calmed down around 2017-18. I've had blips, but it's been quite calm. My general health just began to decline, and my general weakness continued to decline. But the POTS itself and the innate dizziness seemed to ease slightly. And I think it might be just that I learned to manage it more in terms of like salt and things like that. Because I did eventually come off medication for POTS. However, my GP put me on that second steroid, and obviously that had the lovely side effect of making me feel swollen and bloated, and actually just making me look swollen and bloated, but look, it's fine, because ultimately I needed to stay upright. I was not going to leave my job. I was not going to change my life in key ways, if that makes sense. However, that really fell off a cliff in terms of the struggling with heat when it came to winter, and not even winter, probably mid-September on. I felt an immediate improvement in like my heart. My heart felt like it wasn't struggling so hard to breathe constantly. Any small increase in temperature really genuinely caused such an amount of sweating that led to mineral imbalances, that led to brain fog and exhaustion, and that impacted my mood then, and I just felt extremely low, to be honest, all the time. I didn't recognize it for what it was at the time. I remember thinking I was just being really moody, like, and lazy, which I was being moody, but I needed to understand where that was coming from. But I was trying to do all of the things. I was suddenly on, prescription for a new steroid in addition to hydrocortisone, and I was also on prescription electrolytes, which I was taking 4 times a day, and they helped. Like, it's hard to say they didn't help because they absolutely probably saved my life, but they just, nothing was enough. Nothing was ever enough. So all that to say, you can imagine how I was kind of mildly or reasonably concerned when approaching kind of summer 2025, and not even summer, just spring, any increase in temperature. I also live in Dublin now, and Dublin is warmer than Kerry typically, and because Kerry's on the west coast and there's usually more of a breeze, there's more air. Dublin just feels stickier in summer. It does. So I was a little bit hesitant about it. However, this year feels significantly better, I guess. I think I have just had longer being diagnosed. I've had, I suppose, more time to learn what I feel like, but I have been able to come off this year. I haven't needed the second steroid, fludrocortisone, and I haven't needed prescription Diorolite, which is the electrolytes. I do take some electrolytes still, but I just don't need them on a prescription basis 4 times a day. I don't need them every day even. Some days I do. Last week in the heat wave, what I found was I was sweating a lot again, but it felt probably like such an immediate increase in sweat compared to what I had been feeling all summer last year. This felt like a week-long blip. So I was better able to manage it, although I think it is interesting how quickly my mood dropped because I just felt so weak all of the time. Compression socks definitely did help in terms of keeping me walking, but they also increased the heat in my legs, so that didn't really help, Staying hydrated, all of those things that come with the advice when you get POTS, and having salt, that really matters. To be honest, the one piece of advice that has made the largest difference to me, which feels obvious when I say it, is to not drink too much water. And I remember I think it might have been somebody on Reddit said it or something, when I was diagnosed with adrenal insufficiency and was kind of combing the internet for any kind of relevant advice. And I remember thinking, that's ridiculous, I would be so dehydrated. But what they meant was, if you're feeling that degree of dehydration, not to continuously down water, because water, I suppose, doesn't contain all of the minerals that you need. It doesn't contain all of the electrolytes you need. So if anything, it's kind of further flooding your system and washing it out, and you just continue to sweat more, and as you're just sweating out this water. I obviously don't know if that makes sense, you know, biologically, but it's kind of the way my brain understood it. So actually it was to, yes, hydrate and drink a lot of water, but balance that with electrolytes in an equal-ish ratio or a fair ratio, so you don't consistently flood your system. Because I suppose in the heat that first summer I was just consistently drinking water, but I do think I was potentially almost like a floodplain, flooding my system, pulling all of like the silt from the soil or like the salt from my body and just washing it out. So that was a really big piece of advice. I also have got quite a few fans. I've gotten a cold pillow. I've gotten so many different little gadgets and things like that that are helpful, which I can talk about more if you're interested in that. But I do think if you have a chronic illness like POTS or like adrenal insufficiency, it doesn't have to be those, you know, it could be anything, even menopause, and you're struggling with those things. I really think it's important to look at your electrolyte balance and genuinely learn about it. Like, learn how much potassium you need in relation to your calcium. Learn if in the heat a banana is what you need, because that increases potassium, but what will that impact? It is a huge amount of reading, and it is a lot of learning, and the onus is on you. And to be honest, a lot of the time doctors don't know, but it is worth doing, because I think otherwise we're given these kind of maybe cookie cutter advice saying stay hydrated, and that is really not that meaningful, not when you break it down. So that's my experiences. I'm really hoping by next year that if we do have a heat wave, I don't even feel that increase in sweat and symptoms that suddenly. I'm sure, like anyone, you'll experience it, but I would like for everything in relation to adrenal insufficiency to become less dramatic in terms of impact. That's what it feels like has happened over the last year. It feels like everything has become less dramatic. Every time I'm sick, and if I miss a dose by an hour, that's no longer serious. Obviously, it's not something you should repeatedly do, but it isn't life or death. Whereas it felt life or death for that first year post-diagnosis, most definitely, and, you know, the years prior to diagnosis, most definitely. So I'm hoping maybe in 2026 to be able to travel to hot places. That's a dream. It is a pipe dream. But I would like to be able to just go on like a city break and know I'll cope, and not, like, if I was with people, kind of drag them down, I guess, in terms of energy, slow them down. This year I think I maybe would have been able to cope, but not when it got to the extreme heat, and I think I would have needed to stay indoors all day, and that's potentially not the point. I managed the best I could, but yeah. Okay, so I suppose I want to also acknowledge the fact that I'm neurodivergent in all of this, because I think they're not two separate things where you have the medical health history and also neurodiversity on one side. Neurodiversity is overlaid on everything. Being autistic in particular is overlaid onto every single experience. It is a huge part of the factor as to why I'm sometimes a little bit delayed in figuring out what my symptoms mean, why I don't necessarily recognize how much water I'm losing through sweat that quickly, all of these kind of things. So it's vital, it's not an after kind of thought. I suppose the ways in which it impacts me a lot are, particularly, I suppose I'm talking about being autistic, but it is AuDHD really. So ADHD and autism, because in reality I'm not sure on a sensory scale what's what, and I'm not sure it's that effective or not effective, helpful to separate them, I guess, and delineate everything. But I guess one of the ways is it does impact me largely through awareness. I am someone who likes stability. Everyone likes stability, but I like stability and routine to the degree at which it is probably aggravating or boring to other people, but to me it's very steadying. So therefore, when something happens that I can't control in my routine, like a heat wave, I continue my routine. I just continue my routine as if nothing has happened, because I don't understand the alternative. I learn the alternative, and of like, oh, okay, I need to actually dress differently. I might need to actually wake up earlier and get my work done when the main heat of the day isn't happening, blah, blah, blah. All of these things. I recognize and learn these things, but I don't instinctively do it. I don't instinctively recognize it until I have experienced usually sensory discomfort to the nth degree. This impacts my health in terms of like recognizing when I need to updose, which is just increase when you take maybe a mild increase in your medication and your steroid to help you get through the day, depending on if you've experienced a stress. When I need electrolytes, what environments will be like. I find it hard to predict environments. So like that, the day of my adrenal crisis, I potentially should have been able to predict it was a really warm day, and also public transport was going to be crammed when I was on it, and the windows are rarely open. This doesn't tend to occur to me till I'm there and it's too late. And even then when I'm there, I will be sitting there thinking, God, I'm really sweating. God, I'm really uncomfortable. This is crazy. And I'll see it as almost an isolated me thing rather than look around, look at your environment, pattern recognize what's happening in the environment, log the details, what can you change? I then also think it impacts me in terms of the confidence of my decisions. I think I undermine my decisions quite a lot due to like my internal narratives about AuDHD, about thinking, you know, oh, I could do this, but actually maybe that makes no sense. And maybe actually everyone else would think that's stupid. Maybe a neurotypical person wouldn't do that. You know, sometimes it can be direct comparison of saying my sister wouldn't do that and she makes so much more sense than I do and she's so much more intelligent. These are comparisons that no one else but myself has put upon me, but they are quite entrenched, like they're quite ingrained in who I am. I'm working on them, but they happen. So it does mean that when I am, say, on public transport and I think maybe I should just get off at the next stop, even though that leaves me like half an hour out from work and kind of in the middle of nowhere, but maybe it would be better to be out of the heat and then come up with a plan. I struggle to make a decision, so I will just kind of freeze and stay. And it's very hard to explain what that inertia feels like because it's almost the most panicked inertia happening, but there's nothing logical happening, if that makes sense. Like there's nothing logical happening in the whole realm of my brain. I think the second way in which AuDHD really impacts me is also around the sensory side of coping with heat. So for example, my mom sleeps with a fan on and I so struggle with the noise of it. It's really consistent noise. It doesn't, like it's not even that loud, but it would take me so many nights in a row to adjust to that noise being there, because otherwise it feels like an intrusive force. And it's hard to describe in the way that I think other people would also agree, that they'd be like, well, I would also find that annoying. And I know other people would find that annoying, but, and by other people I mean maybe non-autistic or neurotypical people, whatever that looks like, or people who are maybe not that are like sensory undersensitive maybe. But for me, it would be like trying to sleep whilst being poked with very tiny, very thin needles repeatedly in my ears. It's very painful, is kind of the only way I can describe it. So therefore I would sleep without a fan and then have night sweats, and that impacts my health. So it's a really good, complicated system I have going. Another thing is also wearing SPF. I have gotten into the habit of wearing SPF on my face and my neck every day. I cannot reapply it throughout the day, unless I'm actively like on holidays at the beach and not wearing makeup or anything like that. But I just so struggle with the texture of it. It's my least favourite part of my morning routine, by far. Like it disgusts me, putting it on my hands and putting it on and letting it sink in, because there's quite a time when it feels quite sticky before it sinks, and I just hate it. Like it feels like a repulsion to me. Like I love the days when I treat myself to not wearing my SPF moisturizer when I'm staying inside all day. I don't do that often because I'm trying to like not age terribly, I guess, and also just take care of my skin, and skin cancer, all of those things, but I really struggle with it. I've gotten into, I suppose, using for like SPF for my body, like sun cream. I've gotten into using SPF sprays and oils, and I can tolerate them better because they absorb quickly. However, they still feel like I am meant to exist throughout the day whilst someone is doing a tooth extraction on me, whilst I'm meant to be enjoying myself in the sun. they're necessary, and the sensory experience of sunburn, much worse. But it's very hard to focus. I used to hate on holidays, my least favourite part of holidays. And I haven't been on a family holiday when I've been diagnosed, but I'd like to go now and see what it would be like. But when my mom or my sister would say, oh, can you put some sun cream on my back? And I used like, the thought of it makes me almost angry, and it's not angry at them, it's angry at the intensity of the feeling associated with it, because it would feel like, number one, I have to feel the sun cream on my hand. I also have to feel somebody else's skin that I don't want to feel, which is a different texture to my own. It's different if I willingly want to touch someone. I would obviously do it because I used to think, God, I am so unstable, I'm the least kind person going. I can't even put sun cream on my sister or my mom without wanting to cry. Yeah, so the sensory experience of that is very difficult. And also the sensory experience of light. I find the sun very, very hard. I find the sun hard in general, but on my eyes I find it very hard. And once again, this is an awareness thing and an interoceptive piece, which is, I suppose, your awareness of your bodily functions and how they're impacting you externally. Is I will get headaches and not realise it's to do with the sun, and I need sunglasses. So I'm trying to do the thing where I leave sunglasses dotted around the place and I just bring them with me. And I've gotten a bit better this year, but I just do find the sun very, very difficult, I guess, in that sense. I also struggle in relation to the social expectations that come with sun, like summer and heat waves, because suddenly you're not coming home from work and doing your routine of like the gym or relaxing or seeing your friends by going to the cinema or dinner or something. Instead, it is like, oh, we'll go to the beach, we'll go for a swim, we'll, all of these kind of things. And you have to make the most of it, is kind of what people say. And if you say, oh God, isn't the sun great? Or if you make a comment about it being too hot, in Ireland anyway, it definitely is a case of saying, oh God, we'll miss it when it's gone, And I'm kind of in my head thinking, I'm like, will I? Will I miss it? And I'm like, I'll miss pieces of it, because it's not like I want the cold instead, but I don't know if I'll miss this, because this is really inconsistent. Because number one, the weather forecast is so unpredictable during a heat wave, and for me, every micro degree really matters health-wise. Whereas suddenly when you have people saying, oh, let's sit out on the roof, let's chill, let's do this, let's do that, I feel like my routine goes out the window, because it does. Your routine, suddenly you're prioritizing spending as much bonding time with the sun, It's like your son is your long lost child, you need to spend time with it because it's going to disappear again. But I find that really dysregulating. It's not that it's not fun, and it's not that I don't do it, because when I do it with my housemates and things like that, it's so fun and it's really nice. Like, I've swam a lot in Dún Laoghaire this year, and also sat out on the roof of our house and stuff in the evenings when it's been a little bit cooler, and they're really fun. They're so nice. So I don't regret those experiences, and I don't regret that they happen, but I do find their infrequency dysregulating. I don't know how to explain that. I also think, and this is potentially related to AuDHD, but also to having a history of struggling with eating disorders, and generally just body image, is I also struggle with clothing expectations deeply. Clothes suddenly change massively, and I think it's different. It's hard, but it's hard, but it's not as hard when you're kind of just out and about and you need to wear like shorts and a t-shirt, because I can gather, okay, the expectation is shorts and a t-shirt. But when you have to go to the office, and suddenly everyone's in really nice linen pants and shirts and things like that, those are things that I don't have practice wearing, so therefore I have struggled with how my body looks in them. I have body dysmorphia, so I just really struggle with knowing comprehensively how I actually look, and having actual clear view of myself. I just don't have a clear view of myself, so I struggle with that quite a lot, especially when what I want to wear are quite baggy, whereas you're expected to kind of need to regulate yourself by having as much skin out as possible to deal with the heat, whereas for me that is very, very difficult, because especially also in relation to Addison's disease, particularly last summer when I was on 2 steroids and like I was extremely bloated. Bloated is the wrong word, I suppose. I was retaining a lot of fluid, and that made me look bloated in terms of my face. It was much rounder than it is now, I think, anyway. And like that's still true to a degree. Like always, I'm on steroids for life realistically, and I'm not yet stable on them. I'm much more stable, but I'm still only 2.5 years out. I find it hard to like how I look, and that doesn't mean I actively hate how I look in clothes, but it does mean I have ways in which I find consistent solace in how I look, and that's through consistent types of outfits. And they're not really necessarily comfort outfits in the sense of like, I wish I could disappear and I hope no one even notices me. They're outfits I really like, but they are consistent and they're made for Irish temperatures, which means typical Irish temperatures. So suddenly when that changes, I find I'm kind of met with the body image piece, managing the sweats of Addison's disease, so health piece, but then also the sensory experience of different textures. I don't love the texture of linen at all. Well, certain linen things. Linen is lovely, but certain things I really struggle with. And those are really, really hard. So for me, that's like especially then if you're meant to wear SPF under that or kind of in and around that, you're meant to have sunglasses on as well. So that's an extra weight on my face, which I struggle with. To me, it's just too much too much variables, and it doesn't stick around and happen long enough for me to get with it, if that makes sense. So I suppose those are the different ways. I'm just gonna look at my notes. Yeah, I suppose those are the ways in which my health and my neurodivergent kind of self impact the heat, and the heat impacts me in those ways. Ultimately, they both contribute to a huge degree of unpredictability and difficulty in decision making, but ultimately discomfort. Like, discomfort is the bottom line of this whole thing, more than anything. Like, I would love to be at Kylemore Abbey now when it's really, really sunny. Like, yeah, last week it must have been so beautiful, but I'm so glad it's not that warm again, because I don't know, I would cope, but I always think I wouldn't be able to cope. I would cope, but I would be unhappy and I would be more lethargic, tired, my mood would be low. I would also be exhausted from the mental gymnastics of thinking about managing my meds, managing my electrolytes, managing my autistic sensitivities, and also maintaining a sense of self in terms of my body image. So for me, it's a bit of a relax when that eases. So yeah, that is the video. This was really rambly and just a bit of some thoughts, and I'm hoping to maybe watch this back in maybe April or May next year and see where I'm at as winter or as summer 26 goes on. Maybe, who knows, maybe I'll have filmed while it's like being in some city break in the heat and I will still be upright, who knows. A girl can dream. But either way, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate you being here. If you'd like to subscribe, that would be really nice. And I will see you all soon. Bye guys.